Hello and welcome to another Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Sir Nigel Rudd, is an experienced chair of listed businesses and investor in emerging growth companies and SMEs. Over the past 25 years, he has chaired companies such as Pendragon plc, the automotive retailer, Pilkington, a manufacturer of glass and glazing systems, Alliance Boots, a global retail pharmacy, Heathrow, the UK airport, Invensys plc, an engineering firm, Business Growth Fund, an investor in growth companies, Signature Aviation plc, the aviation firm, and Meggitt plc, the aerospace and defence firm. Sir Nigel occupied a seat on the Barclays Bank Board for more than 12 years, latterly as deputy chairman, retiring in 2008. Sir Nigel is currently a non-executive director of SAPI Limited, a renewable resource company, and Intuitive Investments Group plc, a closed-ended investment company focused on fast-growing technology and the life science businesses. Sir Nigel is best known for his role in the 1980s at Williams plc, which he turned into a FTSE 100 company. Williams plc remained one of the largest industrial holding companies in the UK until its demerger in 2000 into two separate entities, Chubb and Kidd. Sir Nigel, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Very pleasure.
One of the achievements I missed out was your book, A Chairman's Tale, which I really enjoyed reading. And there were a few patterns that jumped out at me as I read through that. One of those was your entrepreneurial approach. Much of your board journey has been clearly hugely entrepreneurial, and your book is a story of swashbuckling entrepreneurial risk-taking and opportunism, which to me feels very removed from the publicly listed world as I see it today. And yet, under the UK Corporate Governance Code, a successful company is led by an effective and entrepreneurial board. Yet I see few entrepreneurs and few entrepreneurial boards, but there are exceptions. What's your take on that?
I was Chancellor of Loughborough University and they talked to me about running a degree course on entrepreneurial. And I said, you're wasting your time because I think entrepreneurs are born. It's very interesting to see how companies morph from being entrepreneurial to being run by bureaucrats. That happens in most companies. And I think to your point, the larger the company, the less entrepreneurial it is. And there are plenty of entrepreneurs out there. Some succeed, some fail. Entrepreneurs can start a business, but they're not good at delegating. They're not good at a number of other things. And I think in my career, I managed to straddle that, fortunately. I was very much an entrepreneur to start with, but I then became mainstream in terms of a company chairman, et cetera, et cetera. So my take is that the larger company, the less entrepreneurial it becomes. It becomes bureaucratic.
Do you think that's a problem?
I don't know who wrote this. Somebody wrote this years ago that best capitalism is one of destruction. I think large companies should be broken up. Once they get to a certain size, they're unmanageable and they're run by bureaucrats by very nature.
You built up one of the biggest conglomerates in the UK. That model has now been superseded by private equity. Why do you think that being the case?
We started as a conglomerate in the early 80s, and that's when conglomerates were the flavour of the month. We had Hanson, I looked at Hanson, I looked at BTR, and then we came along and we started our conglomerate because it was something that the market liked. They liked moribund small public companies, taking them over and rejuvenating them, etc., etc. Towards the end of the 1990s, I realised, and my colleagues realised, that the conglomerate days were over. There were a number of reasons for this. One of the reasons was that analysts became much more analytical in terms of where the growth was coming from. So they didn't particularly like, and investors didn't particularly acquisition growth. They wanted growth within the businesses. A lot of the businesses that conglomerates bought, they turned them round, they made them more profitable, but where was the growth? They were in businesses that didn't have a huge amount of growth. And the most important reason was that we couldn't compete with venture capital because the market did not and still doesn't really like public companies having large amounts of debt. And the problem with a conglomerate, if you were to have a large amount of debt and a business went wrong, your rating would collapse and it's all over. Venture capitalists, I'm an investor, co-investor in one of the larger funds, and they have businesses that go under. That didn't seem to worry them because they make 10 times the money in another business. So the overall result is very good. So we didn't think we could compete because venture capital has this two advantages. It has an advantage of having higher leverage, and it has a huge tax advantage because interest is allowable for corporation tax, etc., whereas equity is not. So the cult of equity, in a sense, was killed by the venture capitalists. And you can see the withdrawal from the market of equity today. Companies are going off the market all the time.
So you see it as a funding advantage rather than a governance advantage?
Yeah, I think also venture capital, it depends which venture capital company you're talking about. The ones that have operating partners that go in and sort it out. And they're the people that I call the spreadsheet guys. I don't believe there's any great difference between really good managers in venture capital and really good managers in public companies. I don't see that. But they have an enormous advantage in terms of, I've said, level of debt, the leverage giving them. They take 80, 90% gearing. You only need to grow the earnings 3 or 4%, and you can do the maths yourself.
Let's talk more about the capital at risk piece, which I think is a big part of that entrepreneurial piece. You, as I look back at those patterns, have always had significant capital at risk in the businesses where you've been a board. I think there was just one example that I can remember where you were given shares in the business as opposed to invested in it. I hear today lots of board members, particularly in the UK, when they look at their US peers, saying board members are not paid enough for the risk that they take, and those capable of getting board roles, and particularly in listed companies, but board roles generally, could probably earn much more on a per day basis if they were taking on the equivalent executive role. What's your perspective on that pay piece as someone who's always had skin in the game?
I've always liked skin in the game. When I go into a board meeting or into a company, I always enjoyed the fact that my money was at risk. It's just that extra buzz that you have. Maybe it's just me, but I'm thinking about it all the time. One of my great mantras in a business, when you're making a big strategic decision about selling something, buying something, being taken over, I used to say to my board members, if you owned all this business, if Daddy had left you this business, what would you do? And that's a very good question to ask when you're making a big strategic decision. And because I had an investment, sometimes a smallish investment in relation to the whole business, but it was significant, I always had that feeling, what is right for the shareholders? What is right for the person that owns this business? And I had that mantra. A lot of non-executives don't even think that.
I sometimes hear the counter-argument which says, as a board member, you're not there just for the shareholders. You're there for the broader stakeholders, and in a situation where there's a looming restructuring, you've got to keep an eye on the debt holders as well as other stakeholders. And in other countries, they have a different way of managing that risk. It feels to me that perhaps we're fudging it by trying to ask board members to do.
Look, if you don't look after your customers, you don't look after employees, and you don't look after the environment, you probably won't make a profit. I think you always want to be looking after the various stakeholders. But I actually believe in a capitalist economy, the primary thing would be to look after the shareholders. The point I'm making is that if you look after the shareholders, you look after everybody else.
So the other view I sometimes hear expressed is by not paying your board members and by expecting them to invest in the business, you're making it a very elite group of people who can take on those roles. What's your perspective on that?
I think that's the point, that you don't want to exclude people simply because they haven't got the capital at risk. But one of the things I did at Pilkington was that all the non-exec directors were paid in shares. That was seen as very odd at the time, by the way. But we all were paid in shares, and I think we all did quite well out of it. The argument for directors to have lots of shares in a business is that they will make decisions about selling the business to realize their capital. They might be a conflict of interest, but a good chairman would sort that out. A good chairman would make sure that the right decisions were being made.
Can we talk about your approach to negotiations? Because there were a number of stories in your book which I loved, and would love to understand a bit more about the mental models that you're using when you're approaching a negotiation. The first story that jumped out at me was the Invensys sale of the rail business, where you worked out what it was worth to them, but then closed things down when they chipped on price, which sounded to me, reading that, quite an extreme reaction.
It is one of the deals I'm most proud of. Invensys was a company that was a pension fund with a company attached. It was the old BTR-CB business. It had huge numbers of pensioners. The pension scheme trustees quite rightly restricted what Invensys could do all the time, the amount of borrowing, the dividends they could pay. We were in a hole when I took over. And we knew we had to do something to get out of that hole. We looked at the various businesses and thought, which business can we sell that will get us out of this? And we decided on the rail business. The rail business was a signalling business, one of the top 3 or 4 in the world. A lot of our competitors were integrated. They had the rolling stock, they had everything else, etc. The other thing I knew was that the Chinese were desperate to get hold of our technology because the Chinese had fantastic rolling stock, but their control systems were not as good as you'd hope. There'd been a number of crashes, etc., etc. So when we decided to sell it, we said, actually, there are only going to be 2 buyers, the Siemens in Europe, and there's the Chinese. And I didn't really want to sell to the Chinese, to be frank. So we decided on selling it to Siemens. And we approached Siemens and said to them, you should buy this business. And they said, if you're approaching somebody to buy something, then there must be something wrong with it or whatever. So anyway, we had a long conversation with them, and they said, yes, they would be interested in buying the business. Then they started messing around and all the rest of it. So I went over to Beijing, talked to China Southern Railways, and I said, we're going to put this business up for sale. This is the one business in railway signalling that is in the market that you could buy. There is no other business like this at all. And they got very excited about it. Typical Chinese, they want to do joint ventures, etc., etc. But you know what that means. They just nick the technology and etc., etc. No, you buy the business. So anyway, what happened then was Siemens came back and made us an offer for the board. They talked about the business. And I talked to our chief executive and I said, look, why don't we decide what we want for this business and add 50% and see what they say? And they said no to start with. And then we got into a funny negotiation with them. And we proved to them that buying the signalling business would be really very good, because one of the things I always do in a deal, I always gameplay what the opposition are doing. So we then agreed the price, which was 50% more than the thing with Siemens. At the same time, I was talking to a journalist who intimated that China Southern Railways were very interested in buying this business. So that was in the market. So Siemens knew where we were. About a week before you close a deal, the purchase will try chip on sharp price. And sure enough, the phone call came in from the chief executive of Siemens saying, oh, we looked at due diligence. We got not 25% off the price. I said, that's fine. No deal. We drew the lawyers. We drew everybody from the thing and waited for about 4 or 5 days thinking, I've probably blown this. Anyway, came back and did the deal.
When you said you play the game of what the other party is doing, do you mean scenario planning?
We got consultants to go through their rail business and see how our business would fit with them, and it fitted like a glove. Mm-hmm. So you knew when they were doing the analysis that the people in the rail business would be saying to the Siemens head office, we've got to buy this business. If we don't buy this business, China Southern will buy it. They'll be competing with our signalling business all over the world for turnkey projects, because they've got the rolling stock and they've got the signalling. They've got the package. They don't have the package.
Another story that jumped out at me was your purchase of the BMW retailer,
Very early on.
which was very early on in your career. You bought it before knowing that they would accept you as a franchise holder, and you took a calculated risk that they'd give you a chance. How did you evaluate the risk of them refusing you? And could you imagine yourself doing a similar play today, or was that a move of your youth?
It was part of a conglomerate, this BMW dealership, but it was the best part of it. And so we were looking at buying this privately owned conglomerate. It had these 2 BMW dealerships, one in Hull and one in Doncaster. August was the time when the nameplate change came. We were doing this deal in June time, etc. And we calculated that BMW would want to have no dealership in Hull and no dealership in Doncaster during that peak selling time. So we thought, actually, that'll at least give us 2 or 3 months. Surely they will. And that turned out to be correct. We did actually work that out. There was a bit of a property play in there as well, but it was a calculated risk. We spent 2 days with BMW in Bracknell, I remember, hardly going to sleep, trying to persuade them to leave. In the end, they said, okay, we'll give you 6 months and see how you go. Once we'd done that, we then spent the next 6 months doing everything they asked. If they wanted the tiles changing in the toilets, we changed them. We did everything that they wanted, so they had no excuse to turn us down as a dealership owner.
If you applied a probability, what probability do you think it was that you were taking there of risk?
I think we got a high probability, actually, at the end of the day. Certainly better than 50-50. And we also believed that if they took the dealership away, they would want to introduce somebody to buy it, pay us a premium for the property, because the BMW dealership's all set up there.
One of my favourite books is Super Forecasting, where one of the examples it talks about is the invasion of Iraq, where people went to war in Iraq on the basis of a high probability of there being weapons of mass destruction. When they went back and revisited it, it turned out some people interpreted that as more than 1% and others interpreted it as more than 80%. So one of the lessons is always pin people down on a percentage. So you said more than 50-50, which surprised me because that sounds low to me as a probability.
You look at the downside. We bought the business, so we owned the property. We owned a lot of the second-hand car stock. They had stock on our forecourt that was owned by them, so they'd have to repossess it. And we sold a lot of cars anyway to customers. Yeah. So there's an awful lot of interaction in there that they'd have to dismantle. So I just didn't think they could turn us down at the end of the day.
Third pattern that jumped out to me in your approach revolves around the way you think about strategic decisions. So there's one example that jumped out to me, which was the Pilkington self-cleaning glass, which you referred to as a great idea and a great product, but not a good business proposition.
Pilkington were the world leader innovating in the glass business. They had a huge development group in Lancashire near their head office. They came up with self-cleaning glass, which just sounds fantastic. You saved the cost of the window cleaner. The problem was that the premium price for it was not going to be paid by the market. So you've actually got to work out what the price in the market for this product is going to be. If it's a sufficient premium, that's fine. What we found was, although self-cleaning glass over a period of 20 years or whatever would be very cost efficient and you're talking about high-rise buildings. In other words, you wouldn't have to have window cleaners. Developers weren't going to pay that premium price for the glass to put it in as original equipment. And that's what happened. They didn't.
Have you seen other businesses like that where you discovered they were great ideas, great products, but not good business propositions? Does it come down to...
You do see it. There was another one in Pilkington where we created an online mirror glass. Mirror is made by having a glass, but then putting a backing onto it so it's reflective. We developed a product that you could just produce online. And what happened there was the price wasn't that much different. But the sunken cost of people that made mirrors around the world was to such an extent they just dropped price. Even though we were in the market to sell the product, the mirror manufacturers, they might have been losing money, but they did it in a way that because it was a sunken cost in their plant, etc., they were probably cash flow positive. But these things are quite complex when you look at it. But that's a really good example. So many products today, people that have products, and I look at lots of small companies, people that are going to be disruptors in a market. And you look at them and you think, well, yeah, it's a fantastic idea, but I'm not sure that's going to work.
Yeah. There was another example of strategic decision-making that jumped out at me, which goes back to your time at Barclays, where you talked about when you sold BZW, which you thought was a good idea. Investment banking was not a good fit with Barclays. But then subsequently, you bought the Lehman US business, although it was an investment bank. So I was curious, how did those two things go together?
I think actually, I don't know whether it came across in the book, but the sale of the BZW business was done by Martin Taylor, who hated the business. I was ambivalent about it, to be frank. I wasn't really against it or for it. I thought it was done in a very bad way, and we got nothing for it. They sold it to Credit Suisse. The fact of the matter is, new management came in, and Bob Diamond was able to buy Lehman Brothers at hundreds of millions of pounds less than net asset value. So it was a great deal. And the modern Barclays Capital business, actually, is very much a Lehman's business. So that was a good deal. You can argue about the first deal in selling it to Credit Suisse. I think we gave it away. I fell out with them a bit about it, actually.
You think investment banks do go with traditional high street banks?
There's always a problem with what I call the old joint stock banks, the retail banks, having a capital business, because the people in there are very different. The pay scales are very different. It's really a marriage that doesn't really work that well. Barclays is probably the only European integrated bank left. That tells you something. In America, it works a bit better, although a lot of the big investment banks like Goldman Sachs are not retail banks as well. The theory in Barclays was that you had these huge deposits that you could use in the capital markets to make more money. I could go on for hours about that.
For someone listening to this thinking, what can I take in terms of how to think about strategic acquisitions? How were you evaluating that decision? I can see how, on the one hand, you say that gives you access to a low cost funding base. But as you say, the flip side is actually culturally, it's not very well aligned.
I wasn't part of the management team, but I was there as a non-exec director. So I wasn't involved in the due diligence. You're looking strategically at it. To me, the Lehman's deal looked a very good deal. If I'd been chairman of Barclays or chief executive, it would have been a very different decision or discussion. You're not that close to it. You just have to look at the management and say, is this something that's sensible?
So you were thinking about it more as a transaction. Is this a good investment versus does this make strategic?
Fit in with the strategy that we've outlined to the market, so there's no surprises as far as that's concerned. But as a non-exec director, if there's a strategy to do something, the executive bring forward a deal to do it, then it's incumbent to support them.
Or should you be challenging them?
If you decided on a strategy, you've already challenged it, haven't you? You have the strategy. Now, whether it's the right business to buy in that market or whatever is a judgment to make. But if you have a corporate strategy and the executive are actually carrying out that corporate strategy, it's the job of the non-execs to make sure that the price they pay or that particular business rather than another business is the right one to buy.
Okay, so you would, as a non-exec, you would feel it's your duty to challenge whether it's the right business.
Of course, non-execs are always challenged. It's very difficult as a non-exec to get into the forest.
Why is that? Because for someone listening to this, let's say, who's perhaps taken on their first board role, hasn't got the level of, I mean, if they're hearing someone like you who's got all the experience you have of deal making saying it's hard to get involved, what hope is there for someone without your...
I think we're talking about a bank now.
Yeah.
And that's a hugely complexness. I defy anybody to know
what's going on,
what's going inside that black box or that thing. I think in businesses, manufacturing businesses and marketing businesses or whatever other business, it's much easier for the non-execs to have more of an idea of what's going on and be able to challenge.
You've already, in some of the comments you've made, but it also came out a lot in the book, I thought. There was a wonderful sense of humility and willingness to admit where you felt short in your role. So you gave a few examples where you felt nobody was listening to you. I think the Barclays preemption rights with the Qataris and the Lehman purchase where you wrote, nobody seemed to take much notice of me. Any reflections for a board member listening to this, struggling with what I've labeled Cassandra syndrome, where you're sitting there in the board, you feel like you know what the right thing to do is, and yet no one's taking notice. And in a sense, there's not much good knowing what the right thing if you don't manage to take people with you.
It's a question of degree, isn't it? If you're as a non-exec fundamentally think these people are making the wrong decision and you're in a minority, you should resign. Simple as that.
Have you ever resigned?
Have I actually ever resigned? I don't think I have it.
Does that mean you've never thought the board was doing the fundamentally wrong thing?
Never enough to resign, because I say it's a question of degree. I thought, particularly when they were doing the Qatari deal, that Barclays would be hugely criticised for not offering shares to existing shareholders, preemption. And I said that you are going to get hammered by this. And they said, yes, we know this, but the Qataris want the shares. They don't want to have the shares taken off them by other shareholders. Okay, but you must understand, I think, that you'll get into huge trouble. The chairman, Marcus Agius, got into huge trouble the next day, AGM, and Barclays was really blackballed by the city because they'd ridden through this preemption, which is a big thing for the large shareholders. They don't like to be diluted without having an opportunity to take up the shares. And I told them that. Now, was that a big enough thing to resign? No, not really, because we were in a critical position. If I'd resigned then, the damage done to the business would have been huge because the press would have been all over why has Nigel Rudd resigned, etc., etc. We were in a critical period of raising money. So I wasn't going to jeopardize the business by doing something that would be too hugely damaging for the business. All I did was warn them that there would be consequences.
You referenced how you backed down on the appointment of Richard Broadbent as chair because Diamond was against it. And you wrote that you regretted it. What happened and what is the lesson for anyone listening to this?
Richard Broadbent, ex-Treasury, knew the banking industry well, was quite tough in board. He asked questions, he probed. He was an excellent chief executive of Barclays Bank. And I put it to them that he would make an excellent chairman. I got the sense that John Barley and Diamond wouldn't have wanted a chairman that was so in your face. They wanted somebody less powerful. And I got that wrong. I went along with it and we appointed somebody else. I think the story of Barclays would be very different if I'd held out there. So that is a regret. Should I have resigned? So that is a regret. I should have said, look, I want Richard Broadbent, because I was a senior independent director in charge of the appointment. I should have stood out and said, look, it's got to be Richard Broadbent. I don't care what the executives think. It's got to be Richard Broadbent. Very difficult to appoint a chairman where the chief executive doesn't want them, because you're starting a conflict straight away. So that's an issue as well.
With the benefit of hindsight, obviously these things are always clearer. But in that moment, if you had been a sort of a coach or a mentor to you in that situation, and for someone listening to this who might be in that same situation right now, what could you have said to yourself that might have changed the way you thought about it? Because I think it's always very difficult when you're in that moment.
There was John Varley, there was Bob Diamond, there was Richard Broadbent. I'd have got them in a room together and said, look, this is going to happen. You better make it work.
What do you think would have happened?
I think it would have taken it, because you don't threaten to resign unless you're actually going to resign. The implied threat that it was a non-negotiable as far as I was concerned. That's where I was wrong. I didn't push it as hard as I should have done.
What was the driver?
Probably just didn't want to rock the boat. As I say, it's not something I'm proud of.
Yeah.
So it's quite difficult to talk about it. I just didn't do the right thing.
How does one learn from that experience? What was the underlying driver? Was it an emotional response? Was it fear?
The thing I would say is, if a chief executive clearly wants a patsy chairman, don't let that happen as a non-exec directors. A lot of chief executives want a patsy chairman that never turns up, goes to Wimbledon and Ascot, uses the tickets, chairs board meetings wonderfully. They all end up at 1 o'clock for lunch. Well, why wouldn't you want to be a chairman that wanted that? A chief executive that wanted that?
Let's talk about CEO succession, because I think it's probably the most important thing that any board does, getting that CEO right. You have had extraordinary experience changing CEOs, and I'd be really interested to hear you talking through some of those examples. So there was East Midlands Electricity. You talk more about that.
And it was my first non-exec directorship back in the early mid-80s. East Midlands Electricity. The chief executive, over a period of time, tried to turn this electricity supply business into a conglomerate. He was buying all sorts of business. No idea about how to run them or anything. It was just because they got cash. But after about 9 months on the board, I started to think to myself, well, this is just ridiculous. This is not good. And I looked around the room at the other non-exec directors, and they were all local, great and the good type people. The only person with any city experience was me. And when it all goes wrong, which it surely will do, people are going to be looking at me. So there was self-preservation in terms of my career there. And so what I did, I went along to, it wasn't a senior, there wasn't such a thing as a senior independent director, but there'd been a director there that had been a long time. I went along to him and I said, look, I'm very unhappy. I'm going to resign. He said, oh, no, don't resign. I said, what I want is first to get a new chief executive. So that was stage one. So we did that. And then I said, we need to fire the chairman, but we're not going to go over the hill until I get all the non-execs signed up to do this. Because I have had an experience where I was going to fire a chief executive and one of the non-exec directors turned turtle on me the night before. And I'll never have that again. We used to call it the death warrant. You have the meeting of the non-execs or the people, and you get everybody to sign that they've agreed the chief executive has to go. So they can't change their mind, because people just get got at all day.
The next CEO succession example you brought out was at Pendragon, where I think on reflection you said Trevor.
I left the board. Trevor was the founder of the business with me. We bought this small BMW dealership in Hull, and we created the largest car dealership in Europe. Trevor was great at running the business, and Trevor continued as non-exec director. But I did counsel the chairman, saying, Trevor's been there a long time. You should be looking to change him over, because when you've been there 10, 12, 15 years, it's not a good idea to still be in the business. And they didn't do that. I was never involved in removing Trevor Finn. He was moved many years later.
So you think that a CEO has a shelf life, and that after that 8, 9, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, it depends. I think 7 or 8 years is about right. Some chief executives are great after 12 years. But they start thinking about their legacy. They start to be thinking about all sorts of things. And if they've been very successful, it's very difficult to remove them. I've got enormous respect for Terry Lee at Tesco, but I've been on record saying I think he stayed too long. He was thinking about his legacy, and Tesco was struggling underneath. Terry would have been better to have gone earlier. By the way, he's hugely successful businessman. He's done other things since. And so I'm not criticizing him particularly. I'm saying that chief executives have a shelf life about 7 or 8 years in a business.
In the book, it was clear you have a very strong idea of how the chair-CEO relationship should function. If you imagine I'm a CEO you're working with for the first time, can you just talk me through the role of the chair, what I should expect from you and what you expect from me?
You should tell me if there's any bad news very quickly. As a chairman, you run the business, I run the board. I'm not going to be interfering in the management of the business. You're the chief executive. All the executives should know that you're the boss. They might think I'm the chairman, but you're the boss of the business. I will never get operational in a business ever, and never have done. As far as the board is concerned, the most important thing a board has to do is to work on strategy. And that's where the chairman and chief executive should work together. So if you're having a strategic review or at the time of the budget, you'll spend time with the chief executive running through all that and counselling him and talking about that. That's where the interaction should come very much in terms of strategy, because to me, that's the most important thing a board has to discuss.
Okay, let's say, we're going to talk about the strategy of the new role. What happens? Would I go off and write it down and give you a paper? How would we go about that?
Yeah, because you know the business. So you would say, yes, we need to open a new office in Tokyo. It's going to cost X and the profitability is going to down for a while, but it'll come back up again because it's the right thing to do. Okay, that's fine. You worked all the cash flows out. Let's see those. You'd have that conversation. I would always look for the downside and say, what if it goes wrong? Is this going to imperil the business? Or are you going to have a black hole where you're putting money into the business that could be used to pay better salaries or employ better people here? You'd have all that kind of conversation. But at the end of the day, the executive should be responsible for producing the strategy. The non-execs should have some say. I used to have 2 strategy meetings. One would be 4 or 5 months before the budget process. Do a lot of blue sky thinking. So before they've done the budget and the strategy for the next year, you have a meeting of the non-execs and everybody else where you just chuck something. Should we sell X division? It's not making much money and we could get a price for it and invest in Y division. Why don't we do that? What's the problem with that? Or should we sell the business? There's a competitor that wants to buy. Should we quietly put the business up? You don't want to unnerve the executive, but you'd have a really good chat and then they produce the strategic plan and the budget. But I always quite like to have the non-execs involved in that because, quite frankly, turning up for a quarterly board meeting is not the greatest thing in the world unless you have something interesting to talk about. But just looking at last month's figures is not something that turns most people on.
In past discussions with chair panels on the New Role board community, there's been a prevailing view that chairs do not need sector knowledge. Now, you talked about how you turned down the chair role of a bank because you didn't have sector experience. Now, given you were involved with banks for as long as you were, it's a frightening thought if you don't think you've got sector experience. Is banking different from other sectors, or do you think that applies?
A highly context-based. I'm trying to think of another business that would be the same, but I think a really good chairman can chair business where they don't have sector knowledge. I mean, I've done that. I've gone from retail, manufacturing, airports. I've done all that sort of thing. I never had a problem getting the basics of understanding what drives the business. In a bank, I just didn't think I had the toolkit. Let's put it like this. I'm not over intelligent. I'm not somebody that can absolutely absorb huge amounts of detail. And I think a banker has to really understand what's going on because there's so many complex parts to the business. I wouldn't know whether some derivative that somebody had signed up was a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe as chairman, I wouldn't have to know. But if it sent the company down the plug hole, surely the press would ask me. I just didn't want to do it because I just didn't think I was up to it, to be honest. If I'm really honest with you, I don't think I was up to it.
What makes banking complex?
There's so many income flows, so many different, and certainly in investment banking, there's so much where the employees can pull wool over your eyes about all sorts of things. I just wouldn't feel I could do that.
Do you think anyone understands it, or do you just think you've got the wisdom to know that you don't know?
That's a very good question. I think banks are very complex animals. Very complex. Where there has been a chairman, the Royal Bank of Scotland had a chairman who was not a banker. That was a disaster. I think the same with HBOS. I think you have to have financial services experience to be chairman of a bank. I don't think it would be allowed now anyway. The government or somebody would stop somebody who has not got financial services experience being chairman of a bank. I don't think that would happen anymore. Quite rightly, I think.
So Nigel, time has flown by, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a short response if you're ready. Best book every board member should read and why?
I should read A Chairman's Tale. But seriously, the book that I've always enjoyed, and I've read it several times, is Animal Farm. And I tell you why. Obviously, it was a satire on dictatorship, and particularly the Soviet dictatorship. But the characters in Animal Farm, the pigs and the donkeys and all the rest of it, actually, that you could see them in business. The bully, the person that goes along with stuff. So I would say read Animal Farm and you'll see an awful lot in your colleagues.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
Non-execs that ask questions where they already know the answer.
Most valuable board ritual?
Calling a break.
Favourite quote? My
favourite quote is if I got irritated with a non-exec director, I'd just put my hand up and say, thank you very much for your contribution.
Worst professional advice you've ever received?
My mother, when I qualified as an accountant, she wanted me to stay in practice. I said, I want to be on the pitch, not in the grandstand. That's why I didn't want to be an auditor or whatever. I like being on the pitch. There are so many people who have fantastic ideas, but they've never been on the pitch. They're in the grandstand. Journalists, all sorts of people, financial journalists. They're in the grandstand. If you're on the pitch, you make things happen. You're not just criticizing.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I think probably diversity. I always thought that boards, you should know the people that are joining the board. And that worked very well because you knew people who would really fit in and work together. But I think the way that diversity now is there, and you're really not supposed to have too many people that are like mates on the board. It kind of worked well, but yeah, that's the change that I would say has been very good.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
I was forced to resign from a little pharmaceutical company where I had a shareholding by the corporate governance people because I was overboarded. They appointed a chairman and a new chief executive who completely wrecked the business. I should have never agreed to drop down from the board. But I was under pressure from the people that decided how they're going to vote. They
assess the proxies.
Yeah, I made a bad judgment there. I was an investor in the business and I lost all the money. It was a bad decision. I should have stayed.
Could you have stayed?
Yeah. I just told them to start off.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
Confidence. You might be a very confident person. I don't know what you are inside, but you seem quite confident outside, which is great. You start off doubting yourself. If you have success, that gives you confidence and you're a better person. Better decisions, I think.
Finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
Business should be fun. I've always had fun in business. You should always look forward to going to a board meeting, not thinking, oh God, I've got 7 hours of this next Thursday. So you want to have fun. I realized very early on in my life what I was good at. So I always employed people who were better at me at the things that I wasn't good at. And that's held me in fantastic stead. I don't have a huge attention span. And I realized being a chief executive, you need that. I wouldn't make a very good chief executive. I don't think I'd have made a fantastic chief executive of a large company. I would employ the best person that was. The third one I can't think about.
So Nigel, I have to confess, when I picked up your book, I wasn't expecting much, but I really enjoyed it. And I've really enjoyed meeting you today. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know our listeners are going to really enjoy this one, and there's so much to take from it.
Thank you, Oliver.
If you found this conversation interesting and would like to be involved in similar discussions, join the New Role Board community. Community membership gives you access to 24-hour discussion threads on boardroom challenges and opportunities like those we've been discussing. Smart online networking events, one-to-one career sessions with our headhunters, third-party board roles, mastermind groups, and Q&As with senior board members. Head to community.newrole.com to find out more.